stories of neurodivergence, yet you can't find the ones that speak to your life. Utopia the campaign aims to platform the voices of neurodivergence across different communities and life circumstances, so we find the words to get the support we need. Join me, Samantha Hugh, Director of ADHD Girls, as I uncover hidden stories of neurodivergence that come from a few, but speak to so many parts of our lives.
Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to the Utopia podcast campaign. I'm really happy today to have Gwen Jansen on the podcast. Welcome, Gwen. How are you?
Thank you so much, Dr. Hugh. I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you this morning?
I'm good as well. Can I start by asking you to tell me a bit about you, what you do, and what is a neurodiverse experience that you identify with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am 33 years old, currently living in the United States, was raised in upstate New York and currently live in Texas. And all of my background is in healthcare. I started my career as a bedside nurse. That was always my passion, and my calling was to do maternity nursing. So most of my career has been in the labor and delivery and maternity care space. And then just through some, unexpected opportunities, was able to move into nursing leadership, where I really found a passion and a calling within the niche of nursing. So I was able to get a couple of advanced degrees focusing in leadership, and spend over the past 5 years within the leadership space in healthcare. I currently do work on the medical industry side, where I'm doing some education and in-servicing around med tech. And I am an adjunct nursing professor for one of the colleges here in Texas for nursing. So I have a lot of healthcare background. That has been my primary career path. And when we talk about neurodiversity, I was actually not diagnosed with ADHD until earlier this year, so at age 33. So I went through the first over 3 decades of my life, kind of at a loss and feeling a little bit directionless, because I was experiencing these struggles that didn't seem to make sense, right? I was doing all of this, personal and professional development work, but none of it was landing, and no one seemed to be able to give me the answers for why I was the way that I was, or why I was experiencing the world in the way that I did. So it was actually through my nephew's diagnosis of ADHD that led both my sister and I to seek diagnosis and really gain a lot of clarity around kind of what our experience had been in the world and in the workplace up until this point. And since that time, I have just spent, countless hours researching, neurodiversity in all of its forms, because I am also thinking that I probably need to be assessed for autism as well. So just really doing as much research as I can to find out as much information as I can, and really help to, the people in my life and the people that I'm connected with to better understand neurodiversity and how it can impact us really across our lifespan and across all facets of our lives.
Oh, that's really interesting, Gwen. I mean, I love hearing your story and the fact that, you've been like literally, worked so hard your whole life and, work your way up to a leadership position in nursing. And now you want to kind of advocate the medical community. Right? Can I just ask a little bit more about your beginnings? It's because that sounds incredibly hard and, also fascinating to me. With your mother, working so hard, and I often hear that, when one is a single parent, how did that impact, you and your sister? Like, were you both at an age where you could be helpful, you could help her or be self-sufficient, or you had to learn to be self-sufficient?
I would absolutely say so. I would say that we, kind of grew up pretty quickly. My parents separated when my sister and I were 6. And even before that, my father was not, really very much in the picture. And in the same year that my parents split up, my mom lost her mom, who she was very close to. And like I said, at the time, my sister and I were 6, we're twins. So when I say that we were the same age, it was a very challenging time for my mom, who we have, through all of our research and everything that we've learned, have realized that my mom is also ADHD, potentially, some other things mixed in there as well. But she was born in 54, right? So grew up in a generation that, approaches mental health and things like that very differently. And, back then ADHD really wasn't even a thing that we talked about. Right. And so growing up with a parent that experienced such significant emotional turmoil, being thrust into this position of being a single parent with 2 young girls to raise, and also experiencing these struggles herself, but unfortunately not having any sense of a guiding force, right? She didn't recognize that she had ADHD until my sister and I started doing, more research into it earlier this year. And now she is, in her late 60s. So, when you kind of think about the implications of that, it was pretty significant, because you have 2 undiagnosed children trying to come up and figure out their way in the world, growing up very quickly, right? In a household that needed their support, needed their, their engagement with how to make sure that the household ran smoothly. And then you add on that level of undiagnosed ADHD and what that means as a parent, and what that means for the 2 children that are being parented by, someone with undiagnosed ADHD. So it was definitely a whirlwind in our house growing up. And I think that it's given us some unique perspectives and some, an approach to life and to work, in a way that motivated us to make sure that we were, successful, and that we, continued our education, and that we would always be able to support ourselves without having that same level of struggle.
Right. So much of it that I want to kind of explore more, because you talk about your work ethic, and that's something that I've been told I have, amazing work ethic as well. But looking back, and looking at the new lens, through ADHD and maybe being autistic too, is that, we give like 110%, 200%, and our productivity level is so much higher than, other people. What these tend to lead to is this, they say perfection is burnout, but then I never really was a perfectionist. I think what I was like a hard worker, and I didn't necessarily do everything to perfection. I just did everything, to maybe the way it should be done, and maybe to the higher standard, and then burnout. Is that something that you resonate with?
I absolutely do. And actually, I had been in leadership for about 3.5 years, the first time that I experienced really significant burnout. And it was, I definitely think, largely in part to my undiagnosed ADHD, but certainly due to that, that phenomena of perfectionist burnout, right? To the sense of, we tend to have that all or nothing mentality, right? Where it's either perfect or it's not good enough, right? And so, or at least our level of perfect, right? When you talk about like, you do things the way that they should be done, that's how we view it, right? It's like, well, what do you mean? Like, why would you do it any other way? Like, this is the standard. This is how it should be done. This is where we're setting the bar. So I don't understand why anyone would expect something different, right? And I really, really struggled in that first director role that I held, which was my second leadership position, or third leadership position, but first director level. A lot of that was due to the fact that I had no idea that the way that I presented myself and the way that I experienced the working world and the world as a whole was through an ADHD lens, right? So I cannot even explain the number of, books and courses and even these degrees that I received, right? The time and effort and money that I was putting into trying to be my best self. And I don't know if this has been your experience at all, especially having a PhD, but my goodness, Sam, like I felt like nothing was clicking, right, to the same level that it was for other people. And when I say clicking, I mean that I would take in the information, it would resonate with me, and it would either be like, hey, that's really simplistic. Like, of course, like, why are we even talking about that? Right. And, or like, wait, but I do those things. So why isn't it working for me? Right. You just have this very different experience than your neurotypical peers. And it really didn't make sense. Right. And I had a leadership team at the time that was, um, in their defense, no one knew this was ADHD related, so they couldn't provide me. It's not like, I shared that with them and they refused to provide resources. Nobody knew, right? But realistically, they were at a loss as well, and so it just led to a lot of negativity and really a toxic work environment that I was spinning my wheels so to no end, right? Like I was just working so hard. I was putting in 13, 14-hour days, 6, sometimes 7 days a week. And it just was never enough. And so instead of taking a step back, right, and maybe reevaluating, and I tried to do that, but again, without knowing about this ADHD, all of that reflecting and self-awareness and everything, it didn't matter because I didn't know how to fix it, right? I didn't know how to hone in on what was going on and how to support myself in the working environment. And so it just ended up that I was doing more and more and more of these same things that weren't working because I didn't know what else to do. And I burned out very significantly to the point where even after I transitioned to a different role, I would say it took me a solid year and a half to kind of recover from that. And I even struggled with identity crisis, right? When I ended up, leaving that role, it was so much of like, oh my goodness, who am I? Right. And my whole career has been building up to this. So now what? Right. Because that didn't work out. So if this isn't it, then what is? Right. And so you just have all of these things going on in your head. And it was not a fun time for sure.
Well, I totally hear everything you say, and actually have parallel experience with the burnout was more like, yeah, you get to a point where you're so tired and stressed and you just need to unplug from everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that means leaving a job. And the identity crisis you had, after spending so long working on this one thing and then trying to figure out if this is really for you, and then maybe daring to try something new or something else that isn't as taxing. That identity crisis I had for a really long time whilst figuring it out. I call it my existential anxiety. But like only looking back, it seemed like one, but the whole time you're in it, just feels like, where do I belong? Into. And that's hard, isn't it? Because like the way society is organized is that you have to choose this one thing, and everyone climbs this ladder, or at least it looks like that's what everyone else is doing. But there are so many people like us who's trying to figure it out, and we end up hiding into oblivion because of our mental health suffered in that process. We don't see people, we don't talk because we don't know how to ask for help, right?
No, you hit the nail on the head with that. Absolutely. Because especially in healthcare, which at least in the United States, even though, we talk about, all of these medical advancements and how, we know more than we ever have. When we talk about medicine as a business, it is extremely archaic, right? Medicine, especially the acute care side, where most of my experience has been in, is run by very, old-fashioned and type professionals, right, that are very much like, this is how you be a professional and this is how you be a leader, and we don't deviate from that, right? Like there is no room for any type of alternative thinking or approaches or anything like that. And so, especially, after getting these degrees and setting out this path for myself that I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life achieving, you sit there and you're like, oh my goodness, like I'm not good enough, right? Like I'm not made to do great things, and all of this hard work that I've put in, is all for nothing, because clearly, like, I don't have what it takes to be successful, right? You frame, your view of yourself based on the construct that society has made of A, what success looks like, B, what professionalism looks like, and C, what leadership looks like, right? And we can talk in a little bit about, because I know that was something that we had discussed, mentioning about the lens of females,
Yeah.
even further in those struggles. But for a neurodiverse individual, you do have this perpetual sense of, I don't fit, right? And what's wrong with me, and why don't I fit into all of these things? Because that is the traditional path, right? And if you're not able to climb that ladder, if you're not able to follow in those same, predetermined footsteps that everyone says is the path to success, you do have a lot of self-doubt, right? And you do go through that existential crisis type of like, oh my goodness, like, where do I even fit in this whole world, right? Like, if this isn't it, and I thought this was my passion, and I thought this was my life's work, where is the place for me, right? And it's so, like, I've had conversations with executive coaches and professors and things like that before I knew I had ADHD, where I was like, because they're like, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, right? You're kind of like, I don't know. I know what I don't want to do based on my experiences thus far, but like, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that that's compounded even further in the neurodiverse community, because there hasn't traditionally been a safe space for us to talk about these things, for us to ask for help without worrying about the negative repercussions, right? So it's, I love all the points that you make there, because it's just so true. And that's very much been my experience as well.
Yeah, I completely get it. Yeah, we know what we don't want to do because we've experienced, the burnout and, the pain of trying to do them. But then what do we like to do? And what I did was just kind of like whatever that felt right. And that was, if I was in a space where I needed to write, I write. And then that became something else, that writing became more. And I suppose maybe that's how you found your way as well. Like, what just feels right at that time. So with your ADHD diagnosis, which you said you got this year at the age of 33, what made you pursue it?
So I think it was realistically when after my nephew got his diagnosis, because like I said, he's 7.5 now. And I remember his pediatrician when he was, goodness, Sam, I think he was maybe 3 or 4. He was very little, right? The first time his pediatrician said, I think he has ADHD. And back then, you have this whole negative connotation of, oh, that means they're going to pump him full of drugs. And why can't he just be a kid? Like, who, like, yeah, he's hyper and he's all over the place. But like, when did that stop being childhood? And when did that start being something that you need to medicate? Right. And so at the time, my sister and I, because we're very close, we were talking through it, and I was like, I don't even know that you can reliably diagnose that at this age. Like, he's a toddler, right? Like, he's so small, and like, please don't medicate him. He's so young. Like, let's just try and figure it out. So, a couple of years went by, and maybe when he was 5, I think he got the firm diagnosis, right? And then when he was, I think it was when he was 6 when, they started to try, different medications and things. And so after he got his diagnosis, I immediately started diving into all of the research that I could find, all of the, organizations that focused on ADHD. And, especially because I have a nursing background and I'm an educator, like, I really wanted to make sure that anything that I was looking at was high quality evidence-based information, right? And so spent a lot of time, diving into what is this, what does it mean, what are the different types of treatments, how can we support him as as adults in his life. And the more that I'm doing research on it, because he has hyperactive impulsive type, right, which is much more common in young boys. As I'm doing research on ADHD and I'm looking into, you know, kind of the inattentive and the combined type, I'm like, I'm like, well, that sounds like everything that I am, right? And so doing a lot more digging into it, and then, you know, as I'm looking at all of these symptoms, I was reminded that I had a therapist in my like mid 20s for a very short amount of time, because unfortunately after I think like 4 sessions or something like that, she ended up moving out of state because she was getting married. But she was the only person, and it only came up once, so it didn't have at that time like a lasting, you know, impact on me. She had asked me in my mid 20s, like, has anyone ever told you that you might have ADHD? And at that time, my knowledge of ADHD was that like hyperactive little boy in the classroom. And I'm like, what do you mean? No, like, that's not me. Right. But then as I'm doing all of this research in adulthood, really resonating with the experiences, right? And there is a lot of misinformation on social media, but it's really unfortunate that there's enough that's the platform that people are talking about it, where it's helping other people to say like, hey, maybe that's what's going on with me. And that was my experience as well. Is once I kind of was learning about these symptoms, I'm like, I really think that sounds like me, following content creators and they're talking about their lived experiences. And I was like, oh my goodness, it's like they've been looking into my life this whole time. Because I think, you know, really it's about listening to other people's stories and how neurodiversity shows up for them to better understand how it showed up for me. And so realistically, by the time that I sought my official diagnosis, I was already very confident that that was what was going on. But for me, as a personally, it was important to have that, you know, official, you know, process. And so I ended up just, you know, kind of seeking diagnosis and all that through a psychiatric nurse practitioner here in town. But it really all started with my nephew's diagnosis, you know, and because other than that one therapist one time, you know, no one had ever considered that ADHD was what was going on with, you know, myself or my sister, right? Through our entire lives.
Yeah, you're right. You know, like everything you said about, you know, from the moment of actually finding out through your nephew going through the same thing, and then having more information now, and not just information from medical sites, it's information from lived experience as well, which, you know, didn't really exist back when we were younger.
Yeah.
And so that really caused a huge delay, you know, in us really finding out, you know, especially in my culture, we don't think about mental health, you know, nothing like that exists. And if it wasn't because of that massive, you know, change in the whole world because of the pandemic, you know, none of this would really happen. And I think in some ways happened for a reason. It kind of woke everyone up, you know, and now we're kind of focusing hopefully on trying to maybe make society a bit more accessible, you know, to people like us, you know. And it's going to take such a long time, but, you know, every little bit of, you know, even this conversation that we're sharing is going to help, you know, change our mind and perception. And you mentioned also that you identify with, you know, having some long-term health conditions and mental health challenges such as depression and anxiety, and then trauma from your youth, and a few other things. Like, did you want to talk about this? You know, I mean, how this impact your professional and personal life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, you know, that's a big part of the conversation that I'm so glad that, you know, we as adults and professionals are focusing on more now, as people are becoming more empowered to speak about their neurodiversity. And that's that ADHD is the psychological condition that has more comorbid factors than any other behavioral or psychological condition, right? So, and I think that that's even further compounded when you talk about late diagnosis, because, you know, I went through like I said, the first 33 years of my life just trying to figure it out, right? And it was a matter of, I had no idea how my brain was wired. I had no idea how that led to the way that I showed up in the world and at work. And so you develop these coping mechanisms due to your brain wiring, you develop so many levels of masking, because that's really, in my experience, that was almost always a requirement, right? Like I could never fully be myself at work because that was never acceptable, right? Because it didn't fit into what I was supposed to be as a leader and as a professional. And so I think that, depression and anxiety, not to say that obviously we can never know if I would experience those things if I was neurodiverse or not, right? Certainly we can't speculate on that. However, what I can say is looking back at my life with this new knowledge of, ADHD and neurodiversity, I can say that a lot of my depression and anxiety stems from the fact that our society is not built to support or encourage neurodiversity in any of its forms, right? I think that, you spend your whole life trying to force yourself to be something that you never will be. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you're made to feel wrong, right? Because you just can't get it. You just can't be what these other people can be, right? You just can't. Well, they can do it. Why can't you do it, right? And so there's this pervasive thought process of, hey, you work, yourself like a dog, and it's just never enough, right? You constantly, I constantly receive these messages of, never enough, unfit, it's just not right, you're not right, and all these things. So I definitely would say that a lot of my, kind of co-occurring depression and anxiety have a lot to do with the fact that our world is just not built with the neurodiverse mind in mind, right? We have so much value and so many unique talents and benefits to bring to the table, in our professional and our personal lives, but none of these are celebrated, right? Because they've always been viewed as negative things, or because they're different, they're wrong. So I can say that from that standpoint, I can definitely see that the late diagnosis piece has been a big factor for me. But I do know it also co-occurs in people that received a diagnosis in youth, right? And so I think that kind of furthers that that assertion of these things stem from the fact that our society is just not built to support us, right? Or to encourage us.
Yeah.
And even physical things, right? When you and I were talking, I mentioned obesity. Like I have been overweight my entire life, right? I have, tried every diet and exercise regimen under the sun. I've been able to stick with things for a little while, but then always fall back and whatever. So physical health has always been, has been a struggle for me for sure. And again, I think that a lot of that has to do with, with not understanding my ADHD symptoms, or being able to set up systems for support for myself during my formative years, right? So now in adulthood, I'm trying to like fight that battle to create these support systems and make them stick.
Okay.
And so just that whole, that struggle with executive functioning, but also, and this is a whole other conversation, but, using food as stimulation and emotional comfort and all of those things, they definitely impact your professional life and, and everything, because a healthy body, definitely adds to a healthy mind. Not to say it's the fix all for everything, but it does have very positive impacts on neurodiversity symptoms. And so when you struggle with those, the aspect of physical health, certainly those are going to show up in pretty obvious ways at work as well.
Sure, of course. That sounds completely, valid. Everything you said, about your experience of being late diagnosed, and do agree that the mental health challenges are compounded, and the never being good enough is not just in work, is it? Like, say if you have a relationship with somebody, and if they say that to you, and that just brings up all these old wounds of just not being understood, and that is really the main thing for all of us neurodivergents, especially those who are diagnosed later in life. I want to ask you this one last question, and it's based on your professional experience, having been in the nursing profession and being a leader, and now wanting to advocate within the medical community, through your experience of seeing maybe how things are done, whether it is, how patients, are being treated, and, maybe also how healthcare professionals are being trained. Do you think something can be changed or, has to change about the way neurodivergence, it's being the knowledge of it, is being spread to the medical community so they can do a better job?
I absolutely do, because it's been my experience that even people in the mental health space. So the therapist that I see now is a licensed clinical therapist. She's not like a psychiatric, or a psychiatrist or anything like that. And when the first time that I told her that I thought I had ADHD, she was like, "Well, maybe ADD, because you're not always bouncing all around during our calls, right? Because we do virtual appointments still, and being in this world, right, we know that ADD is not a thing anymore, because now the correct terminology is ADHD. But even in the mental health space, there is still this pervasive misunderstanding and lack of information about ADHD and autism, right? I actually read something the other day that was talking about how ADHD and autism, often co-occur, and there's a lot of research that's still being done about how these two neurological conditions kind of connect and what their link is, if there is actually a link there. But they do co-occur, increasingly, as we're finding. And this person online was saying, that it's interesting how we see one as this god awful, terrible thing that needs to be eradicated. Like, who would want an autistic child, right? Like, oh my goodness, that's terrible. But then the other side of it, with ADHD, is that it's just not taken seriously, right? When you try to explain to people how profoundly your life has been impacted by ADHD, you definitely don't get positive reception to that very often. At least has been my experience, right? People will, really don't take you seriously. They don't understand. And they're often like, okay, you're just being dramatic, like, and things like that. So I think that there must be a greater education and understanding within the medical community of what neurodiversity is, what it looks like, and how it presents, because we cannot even begin to hope to support the neurodiverse community if we are so steeped in stigma, right? If we still are left with all of these preconceived notions of, I know exactly what autism looks like, right? And I know exactly what ADHD looks like, and this is how it presents, and this is how it's going to impact that person. And I know you talk a lot about this, Sam, that even within the same type of neurodiversity, everyone is going to experience things differently, right? Mm-hmm. So it's so important in my mind that education has to occur, obviously for the general populace, but at least it needs to be within the medical community, so that we can improve our assessment and diagnosis rates, that people aren't having to seek these things out after years of struggle and research, right? That they are being offered the support that they need from an early age, so that we are decreasing the amount of these comorbid conditions that occur as a result of coping mechanisms and things like that.
Yeah, you're completely right. Like everything you say is just great. The co-occurrences, how we shouldn't, treat an individual based on label, because we often have more than one, or, also our brain works differently depending on, what type of experiences we have. And to provide more kind of needs-based support to people. I love the work that you're doing. Are you focusing right now to advocate within the medical community? Can you tell me a little bit about, wherever people can find you if you're, doing this work?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. So, my sister and I co-founded what we call the END Institute. So END stands for Excellence in Neurodiversity. And, as it stands at this moment in time, it is really just a collaborative and
Mhm.
a safe space for
Mhm.
neurodiverse professionals and leaders really across any industry, right?
Mhm.
Certainly, would really love to connect, and encourage people within the medical community to, to engage with us. But we want to support people even in other industries, because we know, even if it's not through the lens of healthcare, we can hopefully help them understand their experiences and support them in their neurodiversity at work. And that's kind of the work that we're focusing on right now. Long-term goal would be to try and expand that, right, to support, students and, and parents and things like that. But currently we're really focusing on professionals and leaders, and
Yeah.
how can we make their work experience one that is not traumatic, right? One that, truly supports uh their strengths through
Mhm.
neurodiversity. And how can we really improve their lived experiences by reducing the negative experiences that they have in the workplace.
Mm.
So we have, our company has a LinkedIn page, and I post, on my personal page very often, but we also do have a LinkedIn group where you can join, and it's a safe space to have very open and candid discussions about professional and leadership
Mhm.
experiences as a neurodiverse person. We also have a group on Facebook and an Instagram page where we just, share information. So all of those, if you search the End Institute, they should pop up. If you're interested in joining the conversation, we would
Oh,
certainly love to have anyone that would like to talk about it.
oh, thank you so much, Gwen. Thank you for giving up your time today, to really talk about this work and also your experience. I can see that you have so much passion in this field, and I really wish you all the best. And I'm sure, it's going to be a massive success.
Thank you, Sam. I truly appreciate you taking the time this morning, and I look forward to continuing to partner with you, because I love the work that you do, and ADHD Girls is so important.
Thank you.
What did you think of this episode? If it resonates with you, do share it so we can empower other neurodivergents too. We want to open up conversations for neurodivergence across all communities, especially the ones who are underrepresented, so they can get diagnosed and find the support they need in life and work. I'm Samantha Hugh, Director of ADHD Girls, and you can invite me to speak at your organization or subscribe to my upcoming bite-sized video courses on ADHD and neurodiversity via a new learning platform called Qtopia. You can find a link via my linktree within my bio on Instagram and LinkedIn. Special thanks to Qbtech for being such a wonderful collaborator throughout phase 1 of this campaign.